What's up, you guys? My name's Tony. Today we're gonna go over the 3 most important things when it comes to shooting in manual mode. Now, whether or not you just got into photography or you've been shooting photos for a while but you've never really figured out manual mode yet, the 3 biggest things that you need to know are your shutter speed, your f-stop and or aperture, and last but not least, your ISO. Now, why should you know these things? Well, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO are going to be the 3 main components that you adjust to make your photo look right. So before we get into why you should be familiar with these 3 components when shooting in manual mode, we should learn what they do, right? So number 1, the shutter speed. Your shutter speed is the speed of which the camera shutter closes. Depending on where you have your settings set, whether your shutter speed is at 1/125th, 1/30, 1/8000. These settings are going to define how your photo comes out. If you're shooting a car going down the street and your shutter speed is at 1/30, that car going down the street is going to have motion blur because the shutter actuates very slowly. Okay? If your shutter speed was at 1/300 or 1/200, then the car would be perfectly frozen in the frame. Now, depending on how fast it's going, obviously there's factors that play in there, but the higher your shutter speed, the more things are going to be still. Okay? The lower your shutter speed, the more things are going to have motion. Number 2, aperture. Aperture can be defined as the instrument that allows light to come through your camera. Okay, what I mean by that is when you pick up a camera, any camera, okay, right here I have in front of me a Sony a7 IV with a G Master 1635 f2.8 on it. So what that means is that the lowest amount of aperture, or the highest, the lowest amount of aperture I can get on this lens is f2.8. And when I'm shooting at f2.8, that means the little aperture ring inside the lens here is wide open. It's as open as it could possibly get. Okay, so that is allowing the most light to come through my lens. The higher you go up, f9, f10, 13, whatever, the smaller the aperture ring gets, the less light it allows into the camera. Number 3, ISO. So your ISO is a very, very important factor here, okay? Your ISO is the sensitivity sensor within your camera, okay? So the higher the ISO, the brighter the image, the more light it lets in. The lower the ISO, the darker the image, the less light it lets in. Typically, most photographers usually try to keep their ISO at the lowest possible number, right? In this case, the a7 IV, I usually keep my ISO around 100, depending on what it is that I'm shooting. If I'm shooting outdoors, I want to keep my ISO lower because the higher the number, the brighter it's going to be outside. I don't typically use ND filters unless I'm filming video, but that's a different story. Some people would agree that the higher the ISO, the more grainy an image gets, but depending on what camera you have and your lighting situation and so on and so forth, these factors come into play, but they're not necessarily a huge deal. So if you have to boost your ISO up to get a little bit more light in, like if you're shooting night photography, then you have to boost your ISO up, and you can probably fix most of what would come with having a super high ISO in the post-production software. It's not a huge deal. So now that we know what these 3 things do, we're gonna find out why they're so important together. I can't stress this enough, okay? These 3 components are extremely important to understand because if you don't know what they do, then figuring out what settings that you need for a specific shot is going to be impossible for you, okay? And this is the reason why we're trying to learn how to shoot in manual mode, because there's so many different things that you can do with manual mode. We can go from taking a long exposure to just shooting a simple sunset. Or you can go from creating motion blur to creating a photo that's completely still. Now, with that being said, it's important to know how to balance these 3 settings so that your photo isn't too bright and it looks the way that you want it to. Let's dive in. Now, it's important to know what it is that you're shooting, okay? We'll use portraits, for example. If I'm shooting a portrait of somebody and I want, a nice clear visual in their face and then a nice blurred background, a lot of bokeh, and I want the light to be perfect, and I don't want it to be too shaky in my hands, then I'm gonna need to start by setting my aperture to its lowest possible setting, or the lowest possible setting that I can set it at, so that my subject's face is completely in focus. Because the last thing you want is to shoot with your aperture too low and your camera only focuses on their nose. Next, I'm gonna set my ISO, and depending on where I'm shooting, right? If I'm in a studio, if I'm using lights, that's gonna be one thing, but we'll use outside as an example, okay? Because if I'm shooting outside, it's a bright sunny day, I'm gonna wanna use the lowest ISO possible if I'm not using any filters, okay? So on this camera goes down to about 50. I usually don't shoot that low. I usually shoot my ISO about 100 because it's pretty standard for me. Last but not least, we have to figure out what shutter speed is going to work for us, okay? So if we're shooting at an ISO of 100, and we're shooting at 2.8 here because this lens shoots at 2.8, what we're going to do is we're going to use our shutter speed to depict how much light comes into the photo and whether or not we're shooting too low or we're shooting just right. If my aperture is at 2.8 and my ISO is at 100, and it's extremely bright and I'm looking down at my settings and my shutter speed is at 1/200, that means I'm gonna need to raise up my shutter speed to diffuse the light coming in, okay? Because the faster the shutter actuation is, the less light is gonna let into the camera. So the higher you raise your shutter speed, the less light there's gonna be. Now, it's not always the best idea to completely raise your shutter speed, but in this case, since we're not using any filters, it's the only option because we want to get that nice crisp look in the face with the blurred background. So we need a lower aperture, okay? And we're shooting outside, broad daylight, so we need to have a low ISO. So the only other option would be to raise up the shutter speed. If we're gonna hop away from portrait photography and we're gonna go shoot some landscapes, we're gonna wanna have a little bit higher of an aperture setting, okay? Say about f4 or f5.6, something around there, so that we can really capture everything and make sure it's all in focus, because we really want a crisp image when we're taking landscape photography. With this being said, again, you have to adjust for the situation. We went from taking portrait photography, now we're going over to shooting landscape photography, and it's sunset. So if we want to have a nice clear image, we're going to shoot, we'll say f4 for now, right? The sun's going down. You don't want any motion blur in your photo, so what you do is you set your shutter speed at, say, 1/200. Our f-stop, our aperture, is at f4. Now, the photo is pretty dark, okay? So what we're gonna do in this sense is, because we wanna have a little bit brighter photo, so we don't have to touch it up too much in Lightroom or anything, we're gonna raise the ISO up a little bit, because remember before, it was on 100 because we were outside in broad daylight. So now, the sun's setting, we have our other two settings set to the specifications that we want for the photo that we want. We're gonna raise our ISO up just a little bit, 500. If that's too much, lower it down. If it's not enough, raise it up a little bit more. That way we can counterbalance the light that comes into the photo within the camera. So right here, you'll notice I have my camera set up in front of my Rubik's Cube that's on my desk, right? And I have the current settings set at 1/20, f2.8, ISO 800, okay? Now, since my camera is on my desk and it's pointed at an inanimate object that's not moving, it's a stationary object, these settings are fine, okay? Because I'm not gonna have any camera shake. It's set up so I'm not holding it, okay? The object's not moving and the light looks pretty okay. So with that being said, if I wanted to shoot a moving object, and I needed to raise my shutter speed to account for the movement of that object, right? We'll use the example I've been using, 1/200, okay? So we'll raise our shutter speed up here, 1/200, okay? There you go, boom, 1/200. What happened? The photo is dark, you can't see anything. My aperture is still wide open at 2.8, okay? And my ISO is currently set at 800. If I raise my aperture, my photo is gonna get darker. Watch. So that's not the solution, okay? So I want my aperture at 2.8 because that's the type of photo I want to shoot. I want this thing to be in focus and I don't want anything else to be in focus. It's moving, my aperture is at 2.8, shutter speed is at 1/200. I need to raise my ISO up because I'm not using any other light source to shoot this photo, okay? So I'm gonna raise my ISO until it is properly exposed, okay? And Black eye people, I would probably never shoot at ISO 8000, but you see, that's what it took for me to get the right image on camera. Like I said, guys, it's so important to know these settings, because knowing these things and shooting in manual mode will change your game when it comes to photography. And not only photography, videography as well. Okay guys, I hope that helped you out and you understand why it's so important to know how to set your settings when you're shooting in manual mode, because now you can finally create the images that you want rather than having to shoot in auto. With that being said, my name is Tony. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this video, give me that thumbs up button down there. Hit the subscribe button so we can come back for more, and I'll see you next time.